Forest soil needs much longer to recover from logging and bushfires than previously thought. Researchers at the Australian National University have studied Victoria's mountain ash forests and found it takes decades for soil to be restored to a healthy state. Professor David Lindenmayer is part of the team of researchers and he joins us now from Canberra. David Lindenmayer, welcome. So we're talking about the impacts of both fire and logging. Let's go to fire first. What happens to the soil as a bushfire burns through?
So what our research shows, and this has been led by PhD student Elle Bode, she's shown that it takes about 80 years for forests to start to recover, and perhaps even much longer, maybe as long as 150 years. And what happens to the soils is that we lose key nutrients like carbon, sulphur, potassium, parts of the nitrogen component of the soils, and they're significantly depleted relative to unburnt soils.
So what's the impact on the fauna in the area, the flora in the area?
So that is another part of the work. This initial stage of work has looked solely at the nutrients in the soil and also the composition of the soil. So for example, the amount of sand and coarse matter in the soil. But the next phase of the work is to look at what happens to the fungi and the bacteria, the really important parts of what we call the microbiome, which help fix the nutrients for plants and affect significantly the way that plants grow, how fast they grow, how much carbon they store, all of those kinds of things that are really vital in the way that these forests work.
But when you say it takes decades and decades for things to get back to a healthy state, or words to that effect, how do you explain the green shoots coming back so quickly in some of those areas that have been burnt through?
So what we do see is that forests do recover. They do, new seedlings start to grow, trees start to re-sprout from the trunk, those kinds of things. But what we see in the work that we're doing is that there's still a very strong signal in terms of the depletion of soil nutrients and the composition of the soil. So there are really big changes that are quite profound that last many, many decades. So to give you an example, we can still see the effects of the 1939 fires in the soil profile 80 years later. So really long-term profound effects that we had no idea at the start of that would be anything like as long-lasting as what we have seen.
Yeah, and what are some of those specifics in relation to the 39 fire that you've seen?
So we've seen that areas that were burnt in 1939 in the Black Friday fires 80 years ago, we've seen significantly depleted organic carbon, huge reductions in elements like boron, the amount of ammonia, those kinds of things that are really vital for the way that plants grow, the way soils function, how these forests actually function as intact entities. Those things are hugely depleted. Similarly with logging, we also see major changes in the soil, and these are very long lasting. In the case of clear felling, probably 30 years and maybe up to 80 or even longer years after the initial disturbance event.
And are there very different nutrient effects from the logging compared to the bushfires, or are they quite similar?
No, it looks as though that logging, and particular salvage logging, so salvage logging is when a forest is burnt and then the forest is logged after that. So that's what we call post-fire salvage logging. Those impacts look to be particularly profound, and that's because the ecosystem is dealing with several disturbances in rapid succession. What we also see is that where forests are subject to multiple fires, for example, they might have been burnt in 1939 and again in 2009, as we've actually seen in those mountain ash forests, then we see the effects further magnified. So repeated fire has a significant impact in these systems, but also logging is a major effect. And these effects are very long lasting and really quite profound, and much, much longer and deeper than what we had expected to see through this kind of research.
So the forests you tested are key areas for Melbourne's water supply. What are the implications for water supply through these forests if areas are burnt through?
So what we see in these forests is that the way the forests regrow after fire means that we do have rapid growth of trees, but what those forests actually do then is start to use large amounts of water to subsidise that rapid growth of trees. And our other work in parallel to this, led by other researchers in our team, have showed that the amount of water that's lost from logging some of the biggest catchments that supply Melbourne, the amount of logging that's going on will take up to 600,000 people's water supplies. So there are huge effects on yield, and there are huge effects eventually on water costs, because the only way to make up the difference between the water lost through logging is to actually have to switch on the desal plant. And that's very, very expensive water. And that's about $1,650 per megalitre. And we have estimated that these catchments, some of these catchments will lose up to 35,000 megalitres of water over the next 20 to 30 years. That's on a per annum basis. So these are major losses in water supply for a city that's rapidly growing, such as Melbourne, which has just recently gone past 5 million people.
Yeah,
so yet further work shows that the value of the water in these forests is significantly greater than the value of the paper that's used, that these trees are used to produce. In fact, the ratio is about 25.5 to 1. So the value of the water from these catchments is 25.5 times more than the value of the timber. So it makes no sense economically to continue to cut these forests to make paper.
David Lindenmayer, you mentioned that you're going to do further work on the impacts of the growth for the flora in these areas. It'd be really interesting to talk to you again once you do that. What's your program of research on that front?
Well, so Elle Bowd, who's really quite an extraordinary star young PhD student, she has done extra work now looking at the range of species of fungi and bacteria in the soil. Now, the reason that that's important is that many of those fungi are very important for fixing the nutrients to the root systems of the trees that grow in these forests, which has a huge and profound effect on the rate at which these forests grow. And she's started to see very strong signals showing that the fungi and the bacteria in these forests are changed quite dramatically, just like the soils have been changed. And that's undoubtedly going to have big effects on the way that these forests grow. So there's some really exciting additional work to build on these first building blocks that we've done in these forests so far. So it's really quite important work in terms of how we manage these very important systems that have really important values for water, for storing carbon, for tackling climate change, and a range of other values. So exciting work to come.
Yeah. Okay, David Lindenmayer, thanks so much for talking to us from Canberra this morning.
Thank you.